So here's the project for the TVA theme. It's at 108 BPM. Let's have a listen. That's a nice little quirky theme. I think it's got very interesting elements about it. It's got some old retro sci-fi sounds about it, paired with orchestral sounds. So let's get into it. Let's start off with the Bellephone track. Bellephone is sort of a alchemy patch, and alchemy, you can find an alchemy here. Under Mallet's Bellephone, and it's a warm bell pad, which is a stock one, but there's a lot of tweaking you can see in the track. For example, these different tracks, right? What do? They're all the same Bellephone track. But as you can see, there's different sort of like different modulations and stuff on the track. So for example, the opening Bellephone track, right, has this automation going on of the filter cutoff of the Fat FX, where you can find in multi-FX Fat FX. It's just one of the filters that you can tweak. I took out a lot of the low end in the channel EQ as well, because it's a bit of a boxier sound at the start, and this one sounds like that. And it's not I like to use separate tracks so that I can sort of meld into another track, and it seems like it's just an automation of one track. So you can see that this one's more sort of like radio-like, and you can hear that tweaking of the knob, like goes wee-oo. And that I achieved that with a filter cutoff. So just tweaking the frequencies of the filter and making the resonance really high. So you can see that the resonance here, it's almost at 84%. It's almost at 100%. It's really high, so you get that little filter sweep kind of sound, which is exactly what I was going for. It could be that the original one's more like a pitch, tweaking the pitch rather than a filter, but I feel like this one comes pretty close, and it's an interesting way to solve that sound. So it's the way I want to approach these projects is it's about using your abilities to craft the sound that you want. It doesn't have to be the exact thing. It's about expanding your tool sets to be able to do what you have in your head. And that's why I find recreating these projects really fulfilling and interesting, because it allows me to develop techniques or figure out ways to get the kind of sound that I want. And in this case, this sort of filter sweep sound leading to the full sound, which is over on top here. And you can see this one's really sort of like delay heavy, because in this alchemy patch, you can see that the delay is pushed up, whereas in the others, they're all down because I didn't want too much of a delay. And yeah, so also because the last note rings, yeah, I kind of want it to ring a bit longer, whereas this one doesn't really ring. They kind of disappear. So different tracks for different purposes, and I think it's really important. And I use this button a lot, which is duplicate tracks, new track with duplicate settings. So what happens is it creates a new track, has exactly the same settings. You can tweak it so that it sounds a little bit louder, different, or just EQ differently. And talking about EQ, you can see that the EQ on this track, a lot of low end's taken off, and there's these two sort of spikes here. And why I have these spikes is because there's a lot of resonance on these frequencies for this particular synth. If I took them off, let's see, let's take this one off. This one? Yep. It's a bit spiky. And it's a bit more control here. And the way I do it to find that frequency is actually I push it the other way around. And I hear the resonance. I sort of sweep around and find the resonance, and you can hear that painful sort of resonating sound, so you just take it down, and that's how I do it. So it's more control. And then it goes to this track, which is not as delay heavy, but it's going to Space Designer. You can see that bus 1 is being sent to a Space Designer over here. And in this case, the Space Designer is just something I set to be 100% wet, large and bright. And you can see that it's very open and bright kind of sound. Very resonant as well. It's a really long reverb. And yeah, and if you go down here, you can see the different kind of sounds that we have. So these are more traditional ones. They're sort of string samples. You can find them in Sampler, stereo samples, under Orchestral String Ensemble, which is the top one. And Full Strings Legato is what I'm using to be the bass. So under Orchestral Strings, Full Strings Plus, this one, I feel like I tried using Basses Plus and it didn't sound as good and as rich, so I just used this Full Strings Legato as a bass track. And you can see that in reverb, I'm not sending it to the same reverb as the first one. We're going to bus 2, and in bus 2 the reverb is a string hall under large space halls string hall. So yeah, it's more sort of like suited for strings. And now we pair it with these synths and noise stuff. So this whole thing sounds like this. So you have this sort of synth thing going here. So apart from the chords, which we'll get to, I want to get to the synth noise first. So it's this. Now the noise are not chord dependent, they just sort of triggered. So any key that you play is still be the same sound. So what happens is I just pull all the chords to the sections that I want so that it triggers the noise. And what I'm using for the noise is an ES2 synth, which is here. One of my favorite synths in Logic, if not my favorite. I've turned off all the oscillators except for noise. So if I turn on 1 and 2, it will play chords. which is initially what I did, but I decided to separate the noise from the chords so I could control them better. So this one's just controlling the noise. And you can see that the cutoff here is being triggered by, sort of like being modulated by envelope 2, which is this envelope here, at this amount, which is 0.66. So you see this envelope shape is controlling the way the cutoff is working. That sound is being created by the cutoff, because if we tweak the cutoff, it will change the sort of nature of what frequencies are coming through. So envelope 2 is the thing that controls it. I strongly recommend just tweaking around with this and tweaking this to see what changes in the way this this synth sounds. So if I took the attack from 350 to 0, the sound would attack straight away. If I took the attack from 350 to 1000, the attack would be much slower. So that's how you sort of muck around to get the kind of sound that you want. And another thing is I decided to use the mod wheel to control the attack of the envelope. So with a mod wheel down, you get the full 330 millisecond attack, and the mod wheel up, you get no attack whatsoever because it's fully negative. So what happens is this. So you get the first one with a sweep, the second with no sweep, because the mod wheel is fully up. And mod wheel down, mod wheel up, mod wheel down, mod wheel up, just to get the different textures that we want. And it works with the chords. So this one's pretty straightforward. It's an ES2 as well, with the noise removed and just the chords here. So, and then we have another layer, which is an alchemy track under alchemy stereo. And this alchemy track is a punchy 80s synth. So it's kind of like more harmonics as well. And when you pair them, they kind of work pretty well together. And for the synth chords, I didn't want them to be too bright, so I took off the high end, added a little bit of the high mids. So together they sound like this. And I think it works pretty well with the orchestra. And in context, and I think it works as the sort of harmonic structure, the sounds that give the harmonic structure really, really well. Now onto the drums. What I'm using is taiko drums under factory Japanese traditional taiko drums, and just playing this. And it tends to be one of the go-tos for this sort of big drums taikos. Logic's taikos aren't fantastic, but they kind of do the job. So you got to have some tone shaping a little bit. In this case, the EQ, I'm taking a lot of high end out because it'll be too sort of clicky. You can hear the sticks hitting it, whereas this sort of takes it out a little bit. And also there's a compressor, which for me, all the punchy compressors that I want, I always use Studio Fat and tweak the threshold and ratio to taste. It's just to bring out a bit of that sort of attack there. And I paired it with a big drum under sampler. You can find this really interesting under textures, FX, trailer FX. And it's got all these big sounds like this. So these are meant to be sort of like the hard hits on the taiko drums because there's not much dynamics on the taiko drums itself. So I'm layering this to make it like as if there's a real hard hit coming along. So I did a few things. I compressed it using Studio Fat as well, give that punchiness. Took out a lot of high end, and also sent it to a long reverb under large spaces, halls, long reverb, so that you get that spacious sound. And for the very first hit, I added another trailer FX sound, just to give it that extra. Yeah, you know, sometimes by themselves they sound a little bit fake, but I think in context they work really well. So for example, when there's not much sort of solo instruments, and so the attention is kind of on the overall sound rather than the individual instruments, you actually can get quite a good organic sounding sound when you combine everything together. Now onto these tracks. These tracks are clock tick, which you can find under your Apple Loops clock. Yes, you have clock ticks here, and what we did was we used sort of the slicing, so flex timing, and when you slice them we can just shift the clock ticks to the timing that we want. So in this case it's going chicka chicka chicka, which is the kind of more of this syncopated kind of sound that we wanted. So that's pretty easy. You can get your slices, you can create more slices if you want, and then drag them to wherever you want. I really like flex timing in Logic. Sounds really good, easy to use. So the clock tick is here, and there's a hell of a lot of EQ going on to really sort of make it really small. Otherwise it might be a bit too in your face, like in a room kind of sound, whereas this is just a background kind of sound. So in this case the opening clock ticks as well, it's very heavily EQ'd. If not, it'll be too in your face. So yeah, just as a musical kind of sound, it sounds better EQ'd really heavily. Now here's an interesting one. There's a noise sweep right before the big part comes in, just like this. So it sounds like a reverse noise sweep, but what I used was a noise sweeper, which you can find noise sweeps here, and noise sweeper 5. So this is the one I used, dragged it in, but I didn't use the whole track. I just used the end, and what I did was just chopped off the end and bounce in place, which is here. Once I get the noise sweep bounding in place, I just put my handles here and I held Option and I squeezed that track just to the final beat. So I wanted it to be much shorter. I didn't want it to be so long build up, so it just goes. And I think that's a pretty good lead in for the big sounding stuff. Now in the track itself, occasionally you get little noise rises. Yeah, this is one way to approach it, because Logic has some really nice rises and noise effects. Just search for noise and rises and falls in your Apple Loops, and you'll get some really interesting stuff. And I tend to like to layer stuff underneath just to give it that. You know, in the original track, of course, they're probably using synth textures to do that. These are sort of pre-recorded stuff, but I find that these can substitute pretty well. And yeah, in a pinch, if you don't want to create your own thing, so if you don't have synths that or you might have external hardware synths that you want to sort of have a play around to get textures, in that case I recommend you play around and get them. But if you want to sort of the quick and nasty way, this is the way, and it kind of works. And you can hear that this section there's a brass coming in. So on the sampler, I have brass, full brass, and it's just playing all these. And it's going to bus 1. So most of the brass I do, and I find that it works well when the brass is of these very close chords. All the notes are pretty bunched up together. It kind of works. Or if you want to do sort of like octave type stuff, or just 2-note harmonies. Yeah, so and it works in context really well. So let's have a listen, right? Without the beats. Yeah, it just sits very well, especially works with the strings, the low strings. Just gives it a lot of weight, so it kind of covers a bit of that bass section of the harmonic texture. And there's also sort of like a full strings legato here. You can see under sampler, strings, full strings legatos. This one is just playing these repetitive lines. Just these octaves, a bit of shaping via EQ, not too much, just didn't want it to be too in your face. So I tend to like to scoop up stuff when I find that if they don't sound great and I want them to sit a bit lower in the mix, I kind of find the frequencies that they're sort of like peeking out from the mix and take them down. Sometimes I bring the levels down as well, but oftentimes I just scoop out some EQ just to sort of hide it in the layer a bit. You notice that, you know, in the in-betweens when the chords are not really playing, you hear a little bit more of the MIDI-ish sounding instruments, but I still find that musically it works. And I find what's more important in the work that we do is to create these musical emotions, as opposed to, is this really the most realistic sound that I can find? And that's not as important as saying that, what does this music do? So you always pay that in mind. And there's the second section, which is the really quiet section. You can see that there's an alchemy patch called Angelic Choir under vocals female. And it's sort of like playing this ethereal kind of sound together with the strings. And if you want these strings to sound a little bit more expressive and realistic, one thing you could do, which I didn't do in this project, is to automate them a bit more. You got to find where the strings sort of like go up and down. There's a little bit of pulsing going on, and that tends to lend the strings a little bit more expression and emotion. So even though Logic strings don't really have those kind of dynamic layers, even just volume automation tends to work pretty well. And the rhythm at the back is just a very simple sampler instruments, viola staccato. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And then you have a full brass line here under orchestral brass, full brass, adds the textures. Now this sound is my favorite sound, the whole song, because it's such a sort of old school sci-fi sound, right? And I started with a ES2 sound. So a lot of the synth tracks here, I start with a preset, and in this case it's a Miami lead, and it doesn't have that wobbly sci-fi sound that you get like here. So to get that sound, that's really straightforward. What I did was to map LFO1 to the pitch of all the oscillators, which is through the mod wheel, so that when the mod wheel's at maximum, you get this pitch modulation, which is this. And if you don't have that, it kind of just sounds like this. And with the mod wheel, so that's what gives it that interesting sci-fi-ish sound. Modified the cutoff a little bit. You can see that it's a glide. And it's not too much of a glide, and you can hear that happen through the notes. You can see that the ones overlap will glide, of course. And yeah, when you want them to glide, you just overlap them. When you don't want them to glide, you just don't overlap them. Yeah, and that gives you the expressiveness. So that's what I really like about this kind of old school synth sound, is that they're really expressive depending on what modulations you do, whether it's pitch modulations or whether it's gliding. That's the key to sort of get your synths to sound a bit more alive. And in this case, you can see that there's a space designer here. Yeah, and I just tweaked a standard sort of space designer track to my liking. And there's a bit of EQ as well. Take off the low end, take off some high end, and punch up the mids so that it's a bit more lead-like. You can hear it cut through. Now we're going to the second section of that sort of bridge. You can see that the balafon comes back. So we can have different variations of the balafon now. The low end, I kind of left it. And there's this other track, which is an alchemy track. And it's got sort of similar texture. It's under a mallet's bell as well. It's a Balinese dream. And you get all these synths as well. I really like how all these work together. This is a square pluck. And it's a really straightforward kind of sound. And you have a JP8 poly square as well, which is under sequence elements, under synthesizers. And you notice this one's aren't sent to the reverb, and they just kind of work by themselves. So they kind of act like pizzicato strings, which you have over here under full strings pizzicato. So they kind of work together. So what I like about this track is the mix of synthesized stuff with orchestral stuff. Yeah, it's got this really classical kind of sound in terms of this. And what I have here is a really simple drum kit, which is a Blue Ridge kit. And just sort of scooped off the end and a bit of highs to make it a bit smaller. And there's a compressor as well. This one is platinum digital to sort of tame it and smooth everything out a little bit. And so it sounds like this. Just a brush. So if you took out the EQ, it's a little bit in your face, and this one's a little bit more controlled, so everything together kind of. And then this balafon here, this one's an interesting one because it's a bit more of a tweak, and I wanted it to stand out a little bit more. In the track it does as well. And you can hear a bit of that LFO modulation again, and in this case you can see that, say for example, this pitch here, if I click on this, you can see LFO1 sign, sorry, is being modulated just that little bit by the tune course D is being modulated by LFO sign 1. Just that little bit. And I introduced a square wave as well to this balafon preset. And this square wave is sort of giving that high end. If I take it out, if I add it back in, and it helps sort of bring out the track a little bit more. So, you know, look at the oscillators, understand how these synthesizers work, the sources, right? You can change the sources, you can tweak them, you can learn how to use modulation to effect the stuff that you want to effect, whether it's volume or the pitch, yeah, so that you can shape the sounds that you want. And then it goes back with the same noise sweep as well. And it's kind of like the intro again. But the ending is pretty interesting because you have this. This part's fine. You have a sound effect, like I was saying, you just taking this surging wave riser from the Apple loops, and just putting it in there, and sometimes just fading in, fading out, right? And this one has some pitch shift, distortion, and EQ. So I won't really go too much into these because you can use almost anything to sort of transition between the sounds. So what it's more to taste than anything else. What's interesting here is I had this Bellephone output track, which is also let's open our automation, tweaked with a bit of a filter suite. But it wasn't just a filter suite that happened at the end of the track. I bounced this in place to get this Bellephone BIP, and what I did was put a fade here. You can see this fade here, but instead of a volume fade, I did a slow fade. So what it does is it slows it down and it sounds like this. So you can see that the pitch really goes down as well. And I copied it over, and this time I reversed it. And I reversed not the clip, but the fade. And you can see that this fade is a speed up fade. So when you enter is a speed up fade, when you exit is a slow down fade. So it speeds up and slows down, and it sounds like this. So it's kind of like the opposite of this. And that's how you can do this speed ramps really smoothly within Logic. And I like them because you can tweak the curves of the speed ramp if you want. You know, you can make them go like exponentially or linear. So you can play around quite a bit with these speed ramps, and I really like them. And that's it for this track. Hope you enjoy. Have a download of the project, you know, tweak around with the synths and the mix and see how they sound.